Hey there, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi. So, hi, Dad. I wanted to bring you on my channel today because actually for a couple of reasons. The main reason being that we are both product designers. We're doing the
Hmm.
same thing,
Yep.
and you were doing this thing before I was doing this thing, which
Yep.
is which I think is unique still, and maybe it'll become more of a thing as time goes on. This idea of like generations of people, people in the same family who are product designers. But for now, I still think it's kind of unique. So I wanted to bring you on and share with my audience a lot of the lessons and things I feel like I learned from you really early on. And as you know, I also very much value your opinion on design
Hmm.
in the industry. And you have a lot of really interesting things to say, but also you're just very knowledgeable about the topic. The other kind of part to this is that from time to time, I find myself in my own, at work or at like a design event, and I'll get someone say, "Hey, do you know Andrei Herasimchuk? Are you
Yeah, no,
related?"
the last name is hard to miss.
Yes, yes. It's a very unique last name. No one really knows how to pronounce it unless you do know us. And I just think that's so funny, or it's like so nice when it happens because I'm like, oh yeah, that's my dad. And they're always like, what? Cool. Like that's awesome. But I'm getting married in just about a month and I am changing my name. And so part of me is like, sad to, miss out on those opportunities again. But
I think you should talk to Mike and convince you both change both your names to Steele instead of Stahl.
still, oh,
Steele,
oh,
Alexa Steele, like it's like a superhero name.
that is.
Um, because Stahl is German for steel.
Right,
So
right. Oh, okay. I'll
yeah.
have to I'll have to bring that to Mike and see what he thinks. But anyway,
But
I
yeah,
just love
all
that. And I
good.
thought this would be a really great way to honor the Harassment name, one last time before I change it. So anyway, that all to say, all that
Hmm.
context out of the way. Love it if you just start by sharing a little bit about your story and kind of all the way at the beginning, maybe late 80s,
Yeah.
early 90s, and then a little bit, bring us to present time. You're in Amsterdam now, but just what's a little bit of a quick overview?
Well, I'll try to keep it quick. I don't want to bore anybody with my story, but my story is 30 years in the making now, I guess, with design. So I got my start in design in theater. So I was kind of a theater rat as a kid. I went to lots of shows all the time. I did some internships at something called the Williamstown Theater Festival, which is a professional summer stock theater troupe in Massachusetts. Spent 2 summers there where I got to work with some like Broadway set designers and some Broadway lighting designers and a bunch of famous actors, people like Christopher Walken and Rob Lowe and Amy Irving and a bunch of other names. It was kind of crazy. But I was getting most of my design training in production. So basically, how to build sets, how to paint, how to hang lights, how to do lighting design, how to do blocking and stage management pieces as well. So I was a big theater rat and a movie kid growing up. Movies were the thing I fell in love with. But as I took time away from college and going back to school, I found myself at the late 80s and early 90s, right when the Macintosh came out. And I was very lucky that I was always around the Mac. So my roommate from prep school, when I went to prep school, he had a Mac 128K. When I was in Chicago, where I met your mother, I was working at a place that had like a Mac 2, the original Mac 2 with color. And I went back to school and college in Massachusetts, where I was the Apple student representative for computers because I've always enjoyed using computers since I was like 10 or 11. And I got kind of sidetracked because I fell in love with computers because of the fact I could do 3D animations in them. And I was discovering this is early, like this is 1990 and 1991, effectively. No, 1989, 1990, 1991, where a bunch of 3D products had been coming out for the Macintosh. And I was using them to try to do things like character animation and set design and some other stuff. And fell into this group of undergraduates and graduate students at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And they were building a 3D product. And I convinced them to let me join because I had been using the Mac for a while and I was the student rep at Amherst College and a bunch of other things. So yeah, I was able to actually take a semester or two off from Amherst College, and we were working on this product, and we got funded from a Japanese company. And I went back to Amherst College and said, this is kind of fun. I think I'm going to go do this. and wound up, doing a startup back in 1990, 91, dropping out of college effectively. So that's how I made the transition from theater and production into computers. But I was trained in these other kinds of things. While working at that company, the company was called Specular. We were making a 3D product. We made some texturing products as well. And I worked on an imaging product that did layering and compositing before Photoshop had layers, which is how I got recognized by Adobe. But we were five kids, effectively 20 to 25-year-olds doing software, and we grew to about 40 people, and we had some minor success for about 5 years. And I cut my teeth on doing computer graphics back in the early 90s, and I was designing the interfaces on the product because I was one of the few ones who knew how to draw, knew how to do layout and all that kind of stuff.
And was like that from, where did you learn those skills? Is that from theater?
So I learned that my skills from theater, but this was, like I said, 1990 to 1995. There was not a lot of people doing a job that would be either called interface design or user experience design or interaction design or anything. It was fairly new. I mean, the only people that were doing it were people at places like Apple Computer, Xerox, and Microsoft at the time, quite frankly. And those were all in California and Seattle. And I was over on the Massachusetts side of the country. So I just kind of fell in love with it. Spent 5 years cutting my teeth, doing everything, learning, reading, everything I could to understand how to do this kind of thing. And I got to know the Photoshop engineers because we would go to these conferences, the Macworld conferences that were held both in Boston as well as in San Francisco twice a year. And got to get to know them. And in 1995, they had an opening on the team and they called me. So I got to interview at Adobe in 1995 and I moved out there just on a wing and a prayer. And ironically enough, Adobe at that time had nobody doing the job of interface design in a dedicated fashion. It was always kind of done ad hoc because Illustrator 88 was 1988. Photoshop had come out in 1990. And by the time I joined Adobe, it was on version 3. So the PageMaker was still reasonably early days. It was still kind of early days for this stuff. And I became the first interface designer for Adobe. And so I did that for 5 years. And I built the strategy for what became the Creative Suite, not the Creative Cloud, but the Creative Suite to kind of unify all the products together on Mac, Windows, and 5 different languages, which was probably the hardest job I've ever done. And it was crazy. And whatnot. And after that, I took some time off because I was a little bit exhausted and wanted to make sure I didn't stagnate my skills. So I tried my hand at some Web 1 companies back in 2000. The .com crash occurred. I went back to Adobe to then help get Lightroom off the ground. It was called Shadowland, Project Shadowland at the time, but became Adobe Photoshop Lightroom. Did that for a couple of years. And then when Web 2.0 was taking off, I had a design consultancy in Silicon Valley, which I think you remember, which was called Involution. Got to help a lot of enterprise companies doing stuff. That was great. Had the studio. We had about 12 people, 15 people total in the studio, something like that, doing all kinds of work. And then the next crash occurred, the economic crisis, the housing crisis. Company got moved to Boston. I stayed around and was able to kind of leverage my experience to go join Yahoo and then Twitter. So I was a director of design for Yahoo and Twitter. At Twitter, I reported to Jack, did my share of what I could at Twitter. I was like the 10th designer on the team. I thought when I joined Twitter, because Twitter had been around about 5 years at the time, and I thought I was joining a more mature company, but it actually turned out that I was joining the company right as it was about to go crazy with, taking off on the rocket ship ride. But I got to do things like work on the redesign of the Twitter brand, which is fun, consolidated the Twitter products across the applications themselves. And after 2 years, left Twitter and then joined Figma. And kind of became the first employee at Figma and helped Dylan and Evan for 3, 4, 5 months before they got funding, and then joined them when they got funding. And then we had some disagreements that was just kind of irreconcilable, and we parted ways. And then I moved to Amsterdam. So I joined Booking.com because they got me a work visa. But yeah, now we starting a studio out here and seeing where things go. But that's a long-winded way of going over my 30-year some odd career now. So I've been doing this as old as you are. Maybe by 1 year. Yeah, actually though.
Yeah. And you're at your new studio now, right? In Amsterdam?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit more about what you're doing now?
I don't want to jinx it too much. So I'm trying to keep it a little bit under wraps until we get further along. But basically, Arjan, my business partner and I, he's Dutch, you've met Arjan. He and I are wanting to work on new projects that we feel like have real impact. We don't want to kind of work on the next, TikTok or Twitter or anything like that anymore. I'm kind of past that now and feeling a little bit tired of those kinds of projects. So we've decided we want to start working on projects that involve real impact in the areas of food, health, or energy. So things like the climate crisis or food issues or climate change issues, or even just health and medical stuff. So we're starting that, and we're kind of 4 months into having the studio, but we're about a year and a half into just toying around with the idea. And we've got our first project, which is going to be around food. And we're trying to build some projects and at some point bring in designers from all over the world to come and work with us for a year or two at a time and kind of get a formal apprenticeship program going. So I'm looking to work on projects that are probably going to not be what people are calling moonshots or unicorns anymore. Kind of done with that. I'm going to work on projects that actually make a difference. And I want to find people from around the world, who want to sign up for becoming either, really good in this field as like either principal designers or VPs of designs at companies, or who are looking to start their own companies and just need like a year of getting in the weeds with me and the team on and spending some dedicated time on doing the hard work and learning the skills that you need to kind of pull those things off. So that's the summary.
Yeah.
I'll give people more detail as I feel like we are really ready to handle the load of people bothering me. But right now it's kind of nice to be able to just, Ariana and I can just kind of work a little bit quietly. A few people know what we're doing. We're just trying to get things built.
Yes, definitely. Well, I'm very, very excited for you and to hear more about how it all evolves. Not to backtrack too much, but like long story short, I went to college for a couple of years at a state school in Wisconsin. I went there to play basketball. Ended up not working out. I did go there to study graphic design, and at least in high school, at least in high school, like I remember I wanted to, like, I really enjoyed my art classes, and not to say art and design are similar, but they both are project based. And so I knew I liked the project based work. And so I went to college to play basketball. I did have a graphic design program there, but I remember you saying, if Alexa, if you really want to get into design, you might want to consider going to an art design school. And so I was in this moment 2 years into college where I was super unhappy, needing to like restart, hit a big reset button. And I remembered that. And so that's what brought me out to San Francisco, and you were living in the Bay Area at the time. And I went to visit a couple of design schools in San Francisco, and I was probably there visiting on my like spring break or some sort of break. And you were working at Twitter at the time. And I remember hanging out with the Twitter design team when it was like small group, like you said, 10 people or something. And I just think it's so funny because I didn't really know at that point what I wanted to do with my life or my career. Yeah. And I didn't really know what you did, like certainly not.
I told you a couple of times, but it was hard to get your head around it.
Yeah.
In terms of what the job was.
I was just in a totally different place in my life, but I just I have so many regrets. Like I have so many questions now, like if I were to go back in time and hang out with that group, like it was really cool to see the Twitter design team at that size. And then, I bring this all up.
We were doing a design crit when you came into the room.
Yeah. I mean, that was so memorable for me. And then of course, like when I did end up enrolling in the design school in San Francisco, CCA, and doing that whole thing. I mean, the school I attended was really like traditional art and design school. And I started to get it. It was in my second semester that I took an intro into interaction design class. And I feel like I discovered UX and product design, like kind of on my own. And then finally piecing it together and being like, okay, that's what my dad does. Perfect. And then I felt like I really was able to we were able to connect in this career sort of way, which is really cool. And I learned so much from you. But even just like bring myself back to that time, let's say like 2012, 2013, when I just moved to San Francisco and attended CCA, the design school. The design industry was a different place, as it, I'm sure, was 10 years prior to that. But I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on just like, how do you feel like UX and product design has evolved over the decades? Are there any big moments that stand out that were like fundamental and how things have shifted? Just what are your perspectives, I guess?
Well, not to be a downer, I feel like the places where it's shifted have been largely a little bit negative, unfortunately. And I find that to be so many opportunities missed. I'm kind of a curmudgeon in the field. I'm kind of known for being loud and cocky and arrogant, which is all true. I'm not lacking in any confidence genes, if there is such a thing. Largely because I've always enjoyed making things with my hands. The reason why I was doing theater as a kid is I liked building and cutting wood and painting and making sets. I never saw myself in a 9-to-5 job. So for me, design has always been an activity of making, and all the processes that go into it at some point need to benefit the process of making. So in the theater world, you would build miniature versions of sets. You do things like, build multiple versions of something or test out different ideas in the shop. You don't just build stuff and sit around and talk. You actually have to also iterate through the feel of something. And so everything I've done has been about doing that in a digital form. So the things around prototyping, things around the way research is done to interview people, or how I, work with groups of people to gather feedback for a beta cycle or anything like that. Where I find the problems occurred is when largely the naming problems had started. So there was the first split from my recollection was largely the usability folks and the interaction folks. So the job was largely called interface design. And if you looked at Apple back in the day, in the late 80s, if I recall, Joy Mountford was running the human computer interface team. It wasn't called user interface by Apple. They called it human interface. And interface is just, the thing that sits between the person and the thing that they're dealing with. So the interface was always kind of made sense, but it's also a term that computer folks use in coding, APIs, application programming interface. It's too generic of a word, unfortunately. So people always wanted to change it. Well, when the interaction folks came around, the problem I was having with them is that I felt like they were removing too many of the tangible processes of making. And it became a lot of things like, sticky notes and interviews, and a lot less of drawing and iterating through an idea at the same time. And so to me, it was never one or the other. It was always a combination of the two. And then along comes information architecture people as well, and that became more split. And then you get the web developers, and you get into the 2000s where you start getting like the UX folks starting to talk. And I feel like all that's fine, but they didn't solidify what the job is. They bifurcated it to the degree that nobody knows what to call it and nobody knows how to deal with it. And I find the main split with basically interaction design and interface design was the first one. The second one comes around with UX and user experience design. And then the third one comes with product design, which is what I now tend to call myself. And I know you call yourself that too. And I reverted back to product design instead of interface design, because at least I believe I build and design products. And that's what I do. And it's just a digital form. And I say digital product designer when qualifying it, because I don't want people to think I'm an industrial designer or a product designer in the sense of making like cases and stuff, or whatnot. So those are the three that I feel are the unfortunate ones. At the same time, technologically speaking, the tools are so much better now. With working with Figma and its auto layout stuff, all of that is finally getting there. Figma is adding a lot more of the imaging tools that you would need, so you don't need to use Photoshop as much anymore. You've got things like Airtable to build dynamic databases that have APIs that you can flow into a Figma prototype or a Framer prototype. Framer is also quite a good prototyping tool. The sketching tools, the ability to do things online, the collaborative nature of these things now, all these things have gotten better. And yet I feel like the field is still not accepting enough of what the job is. And the titles and the way people did it had made things more muddy, not less. And that's the part I most regret over the last 30 years, is that I was hoping that it would be a stronger profession with stronger understanding of what the job is about. And now what we have is a bunch of people who don't know how to define the job. And then a lot of younger folks who are getting into this, I feel bad for them because they just have all these questions and they can't get any answers because all the folks from my generation, the ones who kind of started all this stuff, can't agree on what we're doing.
Yeah.
So that's my take.
Yeah.
Sorry to be a downer.
No, that's okay. It's interesting. I think I have a number of questions I wanted to bring up around like questions people ask me that I have somewhat of a hard time answering sometimes. And the title one is one that always comes up, like UX design, product design, UXUI. What do those mean? Like someone who's trying to get into the industry now really has to navigate that, and it is confusing. I feel like I have a clear way that I understand it, but it comes from like a lot of time thinking about it. I'm also really glad that you brought up kind of like the making side of design too, because I also think about that a lot. And perhaps that it's because I did end up going to a like traditional art design school, but it was really ingrained in me. And just design, there's a vast history to making and creating and designing, like creating something intentionally. And so I just think there's so much to be learned still from the past, the vast past in history of design, and how that translates into the digital form.
Well, so that's where the problems come into play with the names and the titles. Like when you talk about interaction design, one of my first encounters was with somebody who called themselves an interaction designer. I was doing a kind of a critique and a review with them on a product at Adobe. They were a part of a different team at Adobe. And they were on a different design team that came up through the consumer products, and they called themselves an interaction designer. I was like, I haven't heard that before. Okay, this is new. This is like 1997 or 1998. And basically, during the review, I was kind of like talking about the icons that they were using for Photoshop Deluxe, the tool icons, and that they weren't quite the same as the way are in Photoshop. And I was asking, like, is your intention to try to make a pathway from people who do Deluxe into Photoshop, or what's the intention, or how are you trying to get around this stuff? Because these icons don't line up, and if you want these to be the same or not be the same, like what's the strategy here? And that person basically looked at me and said, "Don't worry about the icon." I'm like, "What do you mean don't worry about the icons?" He's like, "Yeah, I don't worry about the icons. I'm just the interaction person. I don't draw the icons. Somebody else does that." And my reaction was kind of like, "Whoa, that's a little judgmental or a little arrogant." I mean, I get called arrogant all the time, but that was like, to me, that was almost basically offensive, because I like drawing the icons. And that was the beginning of what I saw as the splits. Basically people removing themselves from parts of the job. When to do that, I don't know how you can do that. People talk about interface design being a stylistic thing. Like, yeah, that's fine, but you can't draw radio buttons or checkboxes unless you know what the kind of choices you're dealing with and what the best kind of choice is to even begin to draw or render the interface. So the whole point of interface design was not to say that you just stylize stuff like some kind of like Illustrator. You actually had to know the function and how things worked to be able to begin to understand how to draw how the person interacted with the computer, the software that's being run on a computer, whether it be a website or an application like Photoshop or Figma, or stuff on your phone. So anyway, just a little sidetrack there on that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, somewhat related. I know I very specifically remember walking down like near the Caltrain, probably near like Pinterest or Airbnb in San Francisco, or I guess Adobe was right there. We were probably at Adobe, and we had this conversation about the term visual design. And I remember you having a perspective on that, both from like the title, like the title of visual design and the skill. I don't know. I would love to have a refresher on what your perspectives are on that.
I still have this problem. People who know me now know that if you call people visual designers, I just want to just scream. It's like I find the term to be derogatory. It's not about visual design. So what people in our business, when they call visual design, they mean graphic design. And to me, graphic design is a very rich field that has been around. I mean, you can call it communication arts now if you want to. That's also fine, whatever that group of people is calling themselves. But visual design was used by interaction designers and then later on user experience people to kind of offload the thing that they didn't want to do, which was make it pretty or make it look good. And to me, that's the old form and function conversation. Does form live without function? Can function live without form? Yeah, I guess to some degree, but in really good products, they're kind of blend and bleed into each other. They're not necessarily distinct. Good form is good function, and good function leads to elegant form. So it's called graphic design. Visual design needs to be stopped by people who use it, and I find it unfortunate that a lot of young graphic designers have call themselves visual designers now, because I don't know if they realize that they've kind of relegated themselves to not having a say in the larger parts of the design, which makes it their job it's more of an aestheticist than a designer, because design is about solving problems. Visual design to me is weird. It's like a strange, what does that mean? Graphic design, just because I know the term better, is about solving communication problems in a graphic fashion, which is also why communication design or communication arts is also fine by me. But visual design always sounds strange. And the way it was used in the late 90s and throughout the aughts was not in a positive fashion, even if people didn't intend it to be that way. It was just kind of, I think, a little bit derogatory.
Yeah, I still hear it from time to time. And I know, like, for the most part, especially when someone says, something about making something pretty, I know they usually don't mean it in like a derogatory way, but it is at the core, like, it's not right. It's certainly not what designers do. We're not just here to make things pretty. Solving problems, being intentional, it's creating something to solve a problem. So yeah, I remember like hearing that conversation.
Yeah. To be clear, that's also why I don't like user experience design as a title, because it's not about the design of something that I think is tangible. So product design is like you're accountable for the product itself. User experience design is, quite frankly, the job of everybody in the company. That's like, I don't think one person should be in charge of that. That's like the entirety of the effort. So to me, when it comes just to titles, I also like consistency for titling, because then it makes it you can do salaries and performance reviews in a similar fashion. So if there's a product manager, well, it'd be nice if there was a product engineer and a product designer and they all had equal weight with each other. That's how I see it. And that's the other reason why I tend to favor product designer over other titles in the company, because then it's easier to make smaller teams. If you want to do the company thing where you make these like little teams that attack issues, great. You pick your, your product researcher, your product designer, your product manager, and your product engineer. Good to go. So I find those kinds of things matter. And I don't have any proof or data or research around this, unfortunately. I wish I could have spent some more time on it, but all I have is 20 years of experience now from when these titles came into play to an industry that is still not doing well and kind of screwed up. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah, not to like, this will be the last question as it relates to titles. But
Sure.
The thing I think people get caught up the most about, that I find, especially when they're starting out and wanting to get into design in a digital way, is there is the path now to become a like digital or web designer or a product designer, digital product designer. In both of those fields, utilize like UX skills, UX/UI skills, because the output is on the web. And I find people aren't clear from the beginning. Oh, maybe I want to get into this and work on a brand team on the marketing website versus working on a product team and working on the product or service. And so that's where I'm finding a lot of confusion, because still you could be a UX designer and work on either. Have you found that too? Or like what should we do about that?
I fall back to what the jobs are. If your job is to build a product, then that's what you're doing. There are processes and tasks that you need to do to execute on building a product. If you're on the marketing or brand team, you have to execute on the communication and a lot of other pieces that are there. So the notion of UX behind it is not that you have a UX designer on each one. Again, UX is the job of the entire company and each team for whatever it's doing. I would still claim you'd want a marketing or a communications designer or graphic designer on the brand side, because those folks are trained in very highly specialized pieces of what communication does and how it impacts and how people process images, or how people see the impact of something when it's bigger versus when it's smaller, and et cetera. Whereas on the product side, you have some of those as well, but you really need more of the impact of how does the flow work? Is it not only straightforward? Is it worth something to take 10 clicks if a person feels like they had better control of the product, versus having something that was streamlined and only took 3 clicks, but they feel like they didn't know what happened? Those are slightly different skills, but they're both what we would call user experience. And to me, that's why I don't find the title of UX as a job title to be useful. It's useful as a thing, but not as the career that we all work in. So I think people in getting into the business now, when they're told they need to have UX skills, that's to me the same as like having photography skills, or having Illustrator skills, or having music theory, or the ability to play a piano, or using watercolor versus using oils. I think people need to think of it that way and get back into what are they actually on the hook for that goes into the world that they made with their own 2 hands. Any designer out there, if you call yourself a designer and yet there's nothing in the product that you can point to that you touched, like with your own hands, whether it be a line of code, whether it be an icon, whether it be some aspect of the product in terms of how like a dialogue and a flow worked or whatever, then in my book, you're not a designer. You're just part of the team. And that's fine. There's no problem with that. But if you want to be a designer, you got to make stuff. That's kind of the end of it.
Yeah, I feel really good about where we got at the end of that. I feel like I even have some things to think about and how I talk about the titles. So thank you. I like that.
Okay, good.
So you have a lot of experience in designing design tools, Adobe, Figma, even in your video work and stuff like that. So I remember very early on when I was learning design, you talked about the importance of software, or I guess like the tools that we use as an instrument. I'd love for you to share your perspectives on that again for everyone.
Any creative field, in my opinion, ones where you make stuff with your own hands, it's important to master and practice the tools that we use with your hands, because your hands are the things that are directly connected to your brain, basically. So if you're painting, you're painting with a brush or with a pen. If you're writing, you're writing with a pencil, or you're typing with your keys. If you play music, I play bass, you have to hold on to these things. The way it feels, it's just kind of the way the tool feels in your hands is kind of how you design graphic tools and how things on the computer need to be there. So for example, if you're practicing with your bass, you're practicing scales. The idea to do that is to get your hands to a point where they're just doing the patterns with that. That way your brain's not thinking about, oh, how do I hold my hand or which string to hit? It's more like, oh, here I'm playing that song. What's the feel? What's the emotion I'm going after? And tools on the computer are the same thing. And it's important for designers to practice the tools that they use, just like a musician practices the instrument. So in either Figma or Photoshop or Illustrator, I remember I used to tell you to do things like take a file or take something you've seen and literally copy it and recreate it from scratch. And the process of doing that is a way of practicing. In a musical instrument sense, it's a way of practicing your scales. Because then what you're doing is you're seeing like, okay, here's how to draw a line. Here's where the shadow goes. Here's how wide things are. This how do I make the box resize in Figma or Sketch or Photoshop or Illustrator? There's all these like mechanical things that you need to find to get good at and have more of the muscle memory going, such that your brain can actually focus on, is this the right thing to do? Should it be this color? What am I trying to solve? Like, is this going to create the right flow? Is this the right, label to put? So yeah, practicing an instrument and practicing your tools, in my opinion, is the same, because as a creative, we use our hands. That's one of the most important things. As a designer, this is the nice thing about designers getting into this business. When they run into problems about not knowing what to do, you can always practice until you find your way, if you will. So there are plenty of ways to just practice building. For all the problems that Dribbble has, Dribbble is great because people are practicing. It's a way to see something. Maybe it gets a little too much in the visual. It's unfortunate. If you look at Figma, now you got these community things where you can see how people constructed their Figma design systems and things like that. If you open up Airtable or Framer, the nice things about those is you can see how people constructed it. So you can actually start to practice yourself what's going on. And yeah, just like a musical instrument, you got to practice until you're there.
Yeah, I remember really early on hearing that perspective and philosophy really on how to use the tools, and it made a huge impact. And I still think about it to this day. I switched careers for a little bit, got into design ops, got back into product design, and I went back into it because I hadn't used the tool like regularly in the same way. So I was like, getting back into it, got to practice. And not only, I guess, to your points, like practicing, learning the sort of design system of design, like how is this thing constructed, but it's also just like, how do I navigate around this tool with the different quick keys and the functions? And it's interesting to think about how it intentionally that tool is designed, like let's say Figma, with that in mind, and knowing, okay, how can I, as like a user of this tool, learn how to use it as if I were playing a guitar or playing the piano.
Yeah, one of the funny things is when I joined Figma early, talking to Dylan and Evan about some of the things around Photoshop and whatnot, they chose some methods in Figma that I've still kind of bummed about because they're more a riff off of Sketch. And as much as Photoshop and Illustrator need an entire kind of rework at this stage, I mean, I'm not going to claim that they're the standards of UI and flow anymore, but I am left-handed, as you know, so I write with my left hand, but I bat and I throw with my right hand, but I play guitar with my left hand, but I golf with my right hand. So I've got this weird kind of like using both hands thing. But the thing about Photoshop, which is always funny, is that most of the keys when we were redoing everything across the Creative Suite was coming from the notion of the thumb holding something in all the major flows, like even like Command E to flatten layers, and which is a new thing that came up in '96 and whatnot. And so using the mouse and then using your hand and fingers was actually very intentional in the creative tools. And I find a lot of the tools these days don't respect that enough. I feel like some of the flow and some of the things aren't quite there where they could be, but that's just my thing. But to your point, it is important to feel the flow and feel how things are going, because you do get into this rhythm. Even with a program like Figma, which has the click and open the palette and then go this, you find yourself getting into this rhythm. And if you start to do it well, you see people who are really good at this, they get into like auto layout. They just like, you see them moving things around and things start to snap into place and stuff. And that's really good. The hope I have is that they don't get stuck in that mentality. They need to get to the point where they don't need to think about it anymore, and now they actually ask themselves, like, what's the right thing that I'm doing? But there is definitely a flow, and the only way you're going to get there is practice.
Yeah, it's very cool. I sort of feel like I use my Mac computer in that same sort of way. Like, I think it was designed in a way for me to like I think about like an instrument and like easily navigating around it. And I get this question a lot. People are like, should I have a Mac computer or a PC computer? Like, what do I need to design? I know technically, like a lot of these tools are available on both. But I guess just like, how would you answer that question if someone was like, should I get a Mac or a PC if I'm getting into design?
Well, I've always used a Mac since like 1986, since I was a kid. The answer to your question is that it doesn't matter, obviously. But generally speaking, there are some subtle details on the Mac side of the fence that tend to be better for designers, whether it be like the quality of the displays and the color reproduction on that, to, in my opinion, like the way some of the file formats and other things work on the programs that have Mac. One of the nice things about when joining Figma was that they intended to write the entire product from scratch, if you will, in GL. And one of the reasons why I joined Figma was because I knew that meant that the product could be available on anything that had GL, whether it be a Mac or a PC. There are lots of people in parts of the world, whether it be in Africa or Indonesia or South America or wherever, where, they can't afford the Mac. So I think they need their tools. I still prefer the Mac. And I think if you ask the question, you're very lucky. I like to base my decision on the integration that I have with other things in my life. So that's going to be the camera on my phone, which I use a lot now. And back in the day, I used to use the Mac because it was easier to hook up a Canon, DSLR to a Mac than it was, or get stuff out of the DSLR to the Mac than it was to the PC, in my opinion. But I think it's better to make a design choice based on the things that you use in your life, the microphone that you've got, the headsets, the cameras that you're using, the things that allow you to extend beyond the computer itself. That's probably where you should make your choice. And it happens to be that you either inherit a PC or live in a place where there's more choices for PCs, whether it be a Samsung phone or a Pixel Google phone, to just how people use the Surface tablets, for example, then that's fine. But having said that, yeah, I've been using the Mac this whole time. I feel lucky in that. And there are days when I can't stand my Mac. Days I want to take the Mac and throw out the window. Just some of the decisions that the folks make at Apple just drives me nuts. Largely having to do with the productivity software, which has, in my opinion, not been great for a long time. Like, I still can't stand using the calendar, the Mac calendar. I know it has a lot of nice features, but I just don't like it.
Yeah.
So, it is what it is.
Yeah, I still use Google Maps and Google Calendar. Despite having used a Mac for pretty much my whole adult life. Yeah, but that's great. No, I appreciate that. And I think that's exactly it. Ultimately, like when you're getting started out in design, just use what you have and learn the skills. And, it's really great that we're in a time where like the software is available across the various types of computers or, systems. What are your thoughts on design trends?
Which ones? So
I guess just like the idea of trends. I get this question also a lot. People are like, how do you stay on top of design trends? And I know, at least I remember you have an interesting perspective on that question.
The way to stay on top of design trends is not to fall in love with a specific one and only do that one for your career, basically. So for a long time, the web was actually a trend. And for people who went all in on the web, they found it very, really hard to make mobile apps, native applications on an iPhone or Android, because the layout system and the system that you use there is fundamentally different because the way that those mini computers render screens. When it comes to things like, flat versus, realistic kinds of interfaces, that's just you got to go with the flow kind of thing. I still kind of prefer a hybrid model, a little bit kind of what material design does to some degree, but even a little bit more than that. There's a company out there called Teenage Engineering, and they have this great Instagram account where they show off all these really cool devices that they make. But if I was to make interfaces again, I would be using their aesthetic in that world, because I like knobs that look like knobs. I like sliders that look like sliders. A line with a circle, I get it, that's fine, but it just feels uninspired to me. It just feels kind of like, okay, yeah, well, let's do that. But it's totally fine. But yeah, to stay on design trends, I think you have to just learn them as they come, but don't fall into the trap of thinking that they're going to be there for the next 10 to 20 years. They're going to change and they're going to shift, largely because you're getting older and younger folks are coming in. And the nice thing about being young is that you get to play and explore, might as well, right? So the old man like me, I'm over 50 now. It's like, so I told you, like, this is how to do it. And you can like, great, okay. F off, old man, I'm going to do it my way. Okay, great, go do that. And when you fail or succeed, come back and let's talk about what happened. But design trends are going to change because people change, and it's just the nature of it. So don't fall in love with one. Learn as many as you can and keep an eye on them. Try to see the next one coming as much as possible. I think that's one of the bigger takeaways that I can say. I've been very fortunate that I feel like I've been working on things that are just slightly ahead of the curve. And that's allowed me to do a bunch of stuff, switching from creative tools to like social media or digital photography, to mobile apps, to enterprise apps, to aesthetic styles. I don't tend to favor either the Windows or the PC, generally speaking. I like to take the best of all of them, et cetera. So that's what I would say there.
How do you notice or stay on top of these? Like, how does one, like, where do you go to see these trends?
Well, I used to do a lot of conferences, which are, I don't know how those are going these days after the pandemic, but back in the day, I would go to a lot of Macworld trade shows and just walk around and take a look at everything I could see. In the aughts, I was going to South by Southwest as one of the things. These days, I think there's a lot on YouTube. you can track, quite frankly.
Is like what startups are doing kind of like a good place?
No, I
No.
think I'm trying to think of the best way to describe this. I think one of the things to do is to follow businesses or industries that aren't quite fully digital. So like, for example, right now, the energy business is going through some crazy stuff. Climate change, the war. If you start listening to a few podcasts of either economics or businesses or whatever, you can start to see, because they're talking about what's going to be happening in the next 5 to 10 years. Those industries are going to start to go more digital, for example. When you look at the car industry, EV cars are about to go through the roof. There's a bunch of presentations on the demand curve going just crazy. Well, get what you can, or go find a Tesla screen and take a look at it, because all those EVs are going to need screens. There's all these different things that are going on, and you should be careful not to get stuck in the world of the Etsy's and the TikToks and even the Airbnbs to some degree, because those are very, very software oriented. Airbnb is not as software oriented to some degree, but there's kind of like this thing that's going on where it's content. You look at content and you pick content. Okay. I mean, there's only so many ways you can do that, I think, right? That are going to be interesting. But if you look at businesses that do the different interaction pieces, like what Uber Eats does, or what Deliveroo does, or now what we're getting into things like the Nest product from Google at home, or some of the things that are happening in electric cars, or the climate change stuff. Those are going to require very interesting problems to solve. Not the least of which is how do you get data in? How do you make it so that people understand what this means? Or if you make a system that allows you to reroute traffic a certain way, what does that have an impact? So those are the kinds of things I would say to do. To find those design trends, you kind of have to start looking at things that interest you outside of pure software. And what I mean by the pure software, consumer software, is this notion of I have content and I choose content. It's like a scrolling feed, there's a card. It's like, if you go to Figma, how many apps do you see that are rendering cards? It's like, I'm still shocked at the variety that people still think they can come up with. At some point, it's kind of like, okay, this is just a card. It's got a pretty picture and a piece of text on it and a nice typeface. Yeah,
especially with how many designers there are now. It's like, done the card. There's only so many ways you can do it.
Yeah, the card is the old school version of the ad banner from the past.
Nice.
It's like, everybody used to do ad banners. Now we're all doing cards.
Yes. Right. Nice. On the trends topic, something I feel like I learned from you growing up too, that has stuck with me, is that I think one of the best ways to follow on trends is through actually following companies where there are design leaders that you look up to, like where they are working, because they're going to be the people that are developing quality teams. And those quality teams are going to be developing quality products. So that's also kind of something that I think about too. Like, where are those people? Where are they working? And what is the work that they're creating? Like, what's that output? I look to them.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a very good point. I would also add to that, then, if you can find any of the talks that they do, whether they be at a conference or on TED or something like that, try to also then just don't stalk them, but kind of stalk them. To your point, if you're going to look for those folks, kind of get a sense of what they're saying and how they're saying it. I think that's a very good idea.
Yeah. Let's talk about portfolios a little bit. Very, very hot topic, especially for early career designers and career transitioners who are also early career. I remember I learned a lot from you on your perspectives, especially as a hiring manager back when I was getting started. So I guess like the main question I'd love to ask you is like, what are your thoughts, or like what sort of advice could you provide someone who's developing their portfolio for the first time, as someone who has reviewed and hired a lot of designers in your past?
Yeah, I'll try to give you some new information on this too, because I've done a few podcasts or talks on this as well over the past 10 years. Basically, the first piece of advice is don't hold back your best stuff. So you have to remember that you are going to be in a pile of 10 to 100 to 200 portfolios that somebody has to go through. And it's just the unfortunate nature of the business right now that we have a lot of designers, a lot of very talented people, and only a few spots at certain companies. And it just takes time. I would love to spend 10 minutes on each portfolio, but if I did that, I'd only get like I'd look through 6 in an hour, and that's not fair to the other 100 that I want to look at as well. So to that point, make sure your portfolio doesn't hold back the best stuff right out of the gate. I think a lot of designers try to do an intro, and they try to talk a little bit about this, and then they get to the stuff, and then the stuff is a choice of things. It's like, okay, I get to pick from 6. Like, no. Show me your best thing. And if I like it, then I'll look at the other ones. But I got to see something that allows me to take and justify the time to spend more time on yours. And that's got to be the best thing. Your cover sheet or your cover page or whatever link you send to somebody to be the portfolio should be unique to that person and that company. So, make your portfolio such that you can attach a unique thing, because basically you have to think about it from their point of view. They have an empty chair and they got a couple people around that empty chair. How were they going to pick you to fill that chair? They have to imagine you sitting in that chair. The people around them have to imagine you being there. And what are you going to provide the team? How are you going to help? Are you going to be a team player? Are you going to, be excited, or are you going to be grumpy? Get yourself into a spot where they can imagine you sitting in an empty slot with them as a team. And then, basically when you get into the actual use cases or the scenarios that you've done in your portfolio and whatnot, make sure you don't make it so that it's too flighty. Be very concrete, very direct, very pragmatic. You don't have time to hope that they understand what you're all about as an interpretation of some kind of like vague notion of what you said. Be very specific, be very direct, and get into what you did, what you didn't do, etc. But those are the first two are the main ones. Like, don't hold back, put your best stuff right out of the gate, and come up with a customized way of sending this along so that they can imagine you filling the empty chair. I think you did the thing that a lot of people also don't do enough, is just give it to a family member or a friend, or give it to other people to have them look at it. Because if you're not getting feedback, you're not going to see the things that they're going to see. And I remember you did that with me, and I kind of gave you the business on one of your portfolios. And
Definitely.
You were that with me.
Well, yeah, I probably was.
But it needed to be said, because I wanted to make sure you understood, like, hey, be careful here. This is like your one shot. Make sure that this one thing that you're showing them doesn't have any holes.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No, I remember really early on, maybe one of my first two versions of my portfolio, like that what you just said exactly. You were like, okay, put yourself in the shoes of the person looking at this. You want them to land here, know exactly where to click into your work, and then contact you. Like, how can they get in touch with you? And that just really changed my perspective on just how I thought about all this. Ironically enough, as designers, it's like you kind of want to think about the design of your portfolio the way you would design a product. Like, who's your audience and what circumstances are they? Like, exactly. What is the goal? So that has really stuck with me.
And the thing about that is, by the way, is as a hiring manager, hiring managers can see that. If your portfolio is put together, they can see that you actually also thought through that part of it, and you go from wherever in the stack right to the top. So it helps a ton to do that.
Yeah, definitely. And it's tough. I think the other thing too is that a lot of people who are getting into design don't realize just how much time it takes. And it does require a lot of feedback, which takes time. It could take years. A lot of people who are transitioning careers are getting started and they'll take like a boot camp, maybe 6 months. That's not a lot of time. When you're in school, like an undergrad program, like that could be 4 years of practice. So I also can't hit home enough. Just if you want to get into this career enough, just know it takes time, stick with it, get feedback, keep practicing your skills, learn how to use the tool like an instrument, and it'll all work out. It will just take a lot of hard work and time.
Well, that's the thing. It does take a lot of hard work and time. That's the one thing that I feel like isn't impressed upon people enough in this business. When I got my job at Adobe, I had spent 5 years, in the trenches at a startup with, making very little money, not barely surviving, had to take care of you because you're a newborn, all kinds of things. So by the time I got to Adobe, I was 5 to 6 years in, and then I got started, quite frankly. You have to be willing to put the time in at this stage of the game. I don't think anything that you think you can do in 2 years isn't going to be worth it. You'll look back in 20 years and be like, wow, that was like a tenth of that time. And I thought it was everything. It's like, no. The 20 years is everything. You want to get to that 20 years out or 30 years out and look back and say, okay, yeah, this is like a marathon. I hunkered down and grew and did all these things. If you're looking to do it in 1 to 2 years, I don't know how happy you're going to be in this business. The point of this business is that you can do it up until you're 80 or 90 years old, quite frankly, because you can just make stuff with your own 2 hands. It's not a 9-to-5 job. It's supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be a long haul, all those things. What you just said is a very good point. Hard work and time. You just have to remember that.
Yes, plus 100. I want to double click into 2 specific questions I have that are more like nitty gritty technical design stuff.
Okay.
The first is that I was wondering, just like, what are your thoughts or what is your philosophy on how you should be organizing your layers? Again, something I remember learning from you early on.
Yes, indeed. I'm a stickler about that. Everybody who's ever worked with me knows that if I open up a file and it's just layer name, copy name, layer, I throw a fit. I can't take it. So I'm going to try to convince people for naming your layers for two reasons that are actually about your career growth. Okay. The first one is that naming your layers allows you the opportunity to understand how structure and systems work to the point where you will actually understand how to integrate and work with design systems in a better fashion. So design systems will yield a way for the work that you're doing to get better with a team or with the company that you're at. So by naming your layers, you're actually kind of also thinking through how it's going to be coded. And that's a super important part to the job. When you just draw stuff and you don't care about how it's named or organized and you hand it off to an engineer, you have no right to be upset if it comes out proper. You have no right, because you had every opportunity to understand how to build it and construct it before you handed it off to them or had them involved in the project. So that's the first thing, is naming layers is a prime opportunity for you to understand how to structure things for design systems as well as how it's going to be coded and built. The second reason is actually because when you start building up a library of stuff that you've designed, when you go back to it 10 years later, you're going to want to know what you were thinking. And naming and structuring layers is a way of putting your thought process into some form that can be seen and worked through. So yeah, when you don't name your layers and stuff, you basically rob yourself of that opportunity 2 years out, 5 years out, 10 years out. I've got files that I worked on at Adobe from 1998 still, and I can open them and I can see what I was thinking. I was like, okay, yeah, I remember this.
Yeah.
I named them all and I structured them in such a way that I know what I was thinking.
Yeah, it's almost like when you journal, like when you are journaling something, you can go back to it and remember like the thought you had,
the
or
thought
like
process.
Yeah. Wow. Interesting.
So those are both very selfish reasons. The last reason is just being a good citizen. It's like, you don't throw your garbage on the street. You don't like do stuff. Stop throwing named copy 1, copy 2 layers into a Photoshop file that somebody else has to use. It's just rude. It's just rude.
That was the thing I was thinking of too. Like if you have to work with someone else, which we often are, whether it's just like a software engineer or another designer on your team, if they are going to go into your file and use it for their work, make it comprehensible.
Layer copy 1, file name 2, 3, 4, version 6. Yeah. Got it.
Totally.
Sure. That makes sense.
Yeah, that's interesting too, just the first 2 points you brought up, because I found recently that whenever I start a new project, when I'm like creating the documentation that's going to be in like Google Docs or like the Google Drive, I've gotten very particular about naming the files, like my filing system, to make sure from the very beginning it's going to make sense. So someone else, they come in here, they can make sense of it. And it's parallels right into like how we use layers. And okay, just made that connection.
Yep. Yeah, naming things is super important.
Yeah. Okay, love it.
Kind of like job titles. Sorry.
Yeah, very important. Okay, one more technical thing I wanted to ask you about, because I also feel a little bit confused about it currently. Grid systems. There's the 4-point grid system, 8-point, like what and why and how what is the right grid system to start out with? What's the philosophy behind there and how it affects the overall design system that you
well, Khoi Vinh did a really good talk on this in the I think in 2004, 2006 timeframe. He runs a blog that was called Subtraction, and he was the digital design director for the New York Times for a little while. And the reason is actually quite simple. This is kind of funny because this gets into like scientific and imperial measurement systems, in my opinion, too. So like imperial systems are like, inches and feet and yards, et cetera, quarts, liters, et cetera. And scientific is millimeter, centimeter. It's everything divisible by 10. So scientific method is divisible by 10 and it uses decimals. So it can be very, very precise. You can go like 2,000 decimals down and understand the measurement. The imperial system comes from, just a long time ago. And it turns out, and Khoi does a really good job describing this, but it turns out if you look at the numbers from 1 to 20, let's say, 12 is the number that you hit, the first number you hit that actually is divisible by the most numbers in front of it. So 1, 12, 2, 6 goes into 12, 3, 4 goes into 12, 5 doesn't, 6, 2 goes into 12, 7 doesn't, 8 goes into 12 because it's actually divisible by 2. So you can get 8 and 9, same way you get 4 and 3, 9 and 3, or 9 and 8 or whatever, 10, is divisible by 2, and 10 doesn't quite do it, and 11 doesn't do it. 10 does do it. So anyway, there's a number of numbers, there's the most numbers before 12 that you can divide into 12 and have a number. And this kind of gets in the notion of ratios and parts. So like if you were lost on a deserted island and you wanted to make some kind of drink that required 1 part water and 1 part fruit juice, well, you can just take any part you want and you have 1 and 1. So you know how to do 1 and 1, or 1 and 2, 1 and 2 of these. So the thing about grid systems is that 12 is actually the magic number, not 4, 6, 8, or whatever. 12 is the magic number because you can make any system below it divisible. So it's not important to know whether you're doing 4, 6, 8, 9, or 12. What's important to know is what your base divisible is by, and that you can then replicate it. So a base 4 is fine. A base 8 is good. A base 9 is good. A base 5 is tough because it can't be divided by 2 easily. You can't split it in half without going into a decimal. So generally speaking, that's useful in design because design, in large part, especially the aesthetic and the visual part, is a lot about ratios and balance. So by having a base that is naturally divisible by its own numbers, you can have a better shot of creating balance, whether it be like a 1 to 2 column thing or a 1 to 3 column thing. All your parts start to naturally organize themselves in ratios. And then you have a better chance of creating balance, especially when you're dealing with white space and other stuff. If you just do things by, the scientific method, your decimals are going to be hard to track. It's just hard to actually execute on. So yeah, so to me, it's not important about whether it's 4, 6, or 8. It's more important that you're dividing whatever base you have that's in a number that can be halved, quartered, and then doubled and stuff like that within itself. That way you can have ratios. But the larger point is go watch Khoi Vinh's talk. It was a conference talk. I think it was a South by Southwest conference talk.
Okay.
But I can find the link for you and you can put it in the show notes.
That'd be great.
He does a really good job of describing all of this.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'll definitely link that in the description below. And I think it also kind of goes back to like the vast history of design, like that balance is a design principle. So we all should be like learning these core design principles and know them well so we can apply them to our design.
Go back to Da Vinci. Ratios are big. I mean, when you go back into the ancient times, in Roman times or Greek times, they didn't have calculators. Well, like digital calculators, they had different ways of calculation. But if you think about it, like there's 12 months in a year. There's 24 hours in a day, 2 12s. There's the way the earth spins around the sun is close to a ratio of 12 or something like that. 12 and 8s and 4s, these are all divisible by themselves, and it was easier for people to then have the building blocks of creating structure. And then as we got better at it, science came around, and then we needed even more precise ways of doing it. And that's the scientific method. But it doesn't mean that the imperial system, in my opinion, is useless. It's actually great, especially if everything goes dark and we all go back to the dark ages because we lose electricity. If you want to know how to make a mojito, it's 1 part rum, 1 part sugar, 1 part lime juice, and some water. It's like, great, I can do that. All I need is a cup. I don't need like my digital scale to tell me it's like, oh, it has to be like 3.6 kilograms.
Design is all intentional when it comes down to it. There is a reason scientifically backed as to why we follow why things make sense, essentially. Dad, this was great. Is there anything, that was all my questions for today. I do feel like we could do a part 2 of this at some point because there are so many more things we could talk about. But is there anything right now that's top of mind that you wanted to share before you wrap up?
Oh, no, I just wanted to get back to your thing at the beginning of the whole session. I found it funny when I would explain to you what I did as for my job and you didn't quite know. And I would keep showing you. I mean, I even took you to Facebook's office, I think.
Yes.
In the early days.
I must
have a t-shirt.
Yeah, I must have been in
2008,
middle school or
2009.
Middle school, that would have been high school. Yes, I had got a Facebook shirt really early on in Facebook.
Right as a freshman in high school, I think you were just
Probably.
going to high school.
Yeah.
But anyway, like showing you around Palo Alto and Sunnyvale and all that stuff, where all the companies were, you kind of just would nod your head and say, yeah. I found it interesting that I never wanted to push you in a certain way, but when you actually, showed a creative interest in the drawing and the painting, I was kind of like, oh, cool. And I would keep dropping you hints the whole time. And because I'm your dad, you're kind of like, yeah, Dad, got it. But I think the hints subliminally did something at some point where it allowed you to click into like, maybe I can go do this. And to say that I was proud and pleased is an understatement. I think it's very, very cool that you became a designer and a product designer at that. So anyway,
thank you.
You've done great, and keep it up.
Thank you. And I am so glad you dropped those little hints because I do remember those moments and all those things. And it all added up to, I just had to kind of like figure it out on my own. And then
Oh yeah. Well, you also don't remember, but when you were touring the art schools, we toured like San Jose State for arts, which that's quite good design school. We did a couple other ones. We talked about RISD, etc. You were looking to pick one. I was like, no, I really hope you pick CCA. I didn't want to push you, but it's like, if you pick CCA, it'll be so much better. And then luckily you decided on CCA on your own. I'm like, okay, good. I can breathe.
Yeah. It all worked out. And it was absolutely all of it was life-changing and the best decision. And I will say, moving to San Francisco at 20 years old, I knew I had you and I had like family, out in the Bay Area a little bit, but for the most part, I was living on my own in San Francisco. It was really tough. Like it was hard. I had to make friends again, but it was absolutely all worth it.
You had your phone stolen twice.
I had my phone stolen a couple of times. My wallet was all stolen. It's a city. You got to be careful.
I know. I told you that, but you're like, I'll be fine.
Yes, okay. This is not the middle of nowhere, Wisconsin anymore.
Exactly.
I worked really hard. It was tough, but it was life-changing. And I'm so glad. I'm so glad I had the support. So thank you. Really appreciate everything.
I'm always happy to do a part 2 if you ever want.
Yes, I would love to do that. I think we should. I'll collect another like series of questions as they come up. These were definitely some that were like top of mind for me that I thought would be good for this first part. But
all right, well, it's 7:30 Friday here, so I'm gonna go grab dinner.
Yes, enjoy. Thank you again, and we'll talk soon.
Sounds good.
Yay! Bye.
Bye-bye.